What's going on? I'm Dan, this is my shop, and today I'm going to give you 3 tips on how to make sliding doors for a cabinet in case you want to try something that doesn't require hinges and that looks really sweet. Now in this video, I'm going to talk about these vertical doors versus horizontal doors. I didn't see a lot of videos in which they talk about vertical doors. Most of them were lower profile, horizontal doors. Tip number 1, plan out the aesthetic you want. So for these, I wanted to make sure to have this walnut and white oak look to it. With plywood, I wouldn't be able to get that same look, so I wanted to make sure to use hardwood. This goes against a lot of conventional wisdom because there could be movement in the doors. I said, forget conventional wisdom, I'm gonna try it out, and so far they've been great. The other thing that's really important for aesthetics is, will the door overset the groove at the bottom, or will the whole door set within the groove? Think about that first. If you're gonna put them all the way in the groove, this door is really easy to make because you don't have to worry about cutting a tongue in the bottom and the top of the door. Instead, you can just cut the door to size, stick it up in there, stick it down, and that can be a really easy door in case you're using this in a shop or maybe a pantry, somewhere where the aesthetics aren't as critical. For the sliding cowboy, I wanted to make sure I had a really appealing aesthetic because this is going to be sitting in the client's living room and they're going to see it every single day. So I worked with them and did some mock-ups and SketchUp to see exactly what they wanted and exactly what would look perfect for displaying, again, every single day while they're having dinner. And as you can see, the entire door is white oak on the front and then walnut on the backside. And that's a really specific aesthetic that you could mock through plywood, but you're not gonna get the same look that you get here by using real wood. If down the road these doors warp, if they twist, if something happens where the client says, whoa, these doors don't work anymore, they're sticking, I could always manufacture new doors out of plywood, but why not go for a really nice look to start? The other thing you're really going to want to consider is whether or not the grooves are going to run along the sides as well. You can't avoid having the grooves on the bottom and the top. The doors just don't work otherwise. But the side is your decision. Now, if you're using plywood, that's never going to be a problem because again, that plywood can tuck right into the side, not a worry. With real wood, if you get any cupping, any bowing, any warping, any twisting, that could cause a problem because you're adding another dimension of pocketing that the doors need to fit into. You might just, like I did, have them flat, and as long as you have a really square door, that door is gonna close into your box so long as your box is nice and square. And so it's an unnecessary cut that you could avoid, and it might aesthetically be more pleasing because it ends up with a more clean, consistent look on the overall cabinet. All right, now that we've talked aesthetics, let's talk about how the door is actually gonna fit inside this. What is the system that allows this whole thing to work? And so the main conventional wisdom you need to think about here is that the bottom groove needs to be shallower than the top groove. And that's simply so that your door can lift into the top groove and then set on the bottom groove. As long as you adhere to that principle, those calculations can actually be varied, but it needs to be able to fit in first up top and then drop down at the bottom. What I used as far as measurements was the bottom groove is 1/8 of an inch. The top groove is about 3/8 of an inch. Now, are my grooves perfectly dialed in? No. In fact, I was really surprised my dado stack seemed to adjust ever so slightly. And so I have about a 1/16 difference between the back groove and the front groove. But again, adhering to that principle, it didn't impact how these doors slide and how they work because my top rails are 3/8 of an inch and therefore they work really well to keep the doors affixed and they can travel no problem back and forth here, and I don't have any issues with the difference there in depth. But again, top groove deeper, bottom groove shallower. Let's talk tip number 2. How do you cut out the grooves in the bottom and the top of your cabinet? There's a lot of different ways to do it. My preferred method and what I did for this build was I used a dado stack. This is a Diablo, it's by Freud. Their dado stack, it's an 8-inch one, but these are really dangerous. I think they're outlawed in Europe as far as I've heard because again, they are a ton of spinning force and they're spinning at you. I think we all know that table saws can be very dangerous. If you don't, go watch all the videos about how dangerous table saws can be. If you don't want to use a dado stack or you don't feel comfortable or you're like, dude, these are illegal, what are you thinking? I get it. You might end up using then instead a router with an edge guide. Now, you're gonna see some videos where people use Festool routers with edge guides, and they're perfect and they're flawless and they make everything wonderful, and those are really expensive. This is fairly cheap, and then you can get the edge guide. Easy thing about cutting the grooves in the cabinet is that you just have to follow along one side. The place where you might need a track is if you need to do grooves deep into a cabinet or a board or something like that. But with sliding door grooves, all you have to do is about an inch away from the edge or whatever your aesthetic is. Make sure you have the right bit for your router. You could use something like a straight cut bit here, and it's gonna have a lot of noise. It's gonna cut fairly harshly along your edges, and if you're using plywood, be careful because it might have more tear out. So you could also use a spiral bit. This one's an upcut bit, and you can use an upcut bit, but if you do it, make sure you very gently lower the depth on your router. Don't try to hog it out all at once. Slowly get to your final depth and you will have much less tear out. If you want to be safer, a spiral down cut bit will be better with plywood because it's not pulling up, it's pulling down, and so you should have less tear out. Lastly, if you're like, I don't want to use a router, I don't want to use a router table, I don't want to use a dado stack, you can still just use a single blade on a table saw, lower that blade, and then do multiple passes. The reason I don't prefer this is because there's just more potential error there. You have to set your fence, cut once, reset your fence, cut again, reset, cut again. And again, all those times over and over and over have the potential to have more error in them. And so I would like to reduce that. I feel comfortable using a dado stack, and so that's my preferred method. And while we're talking about cutting, let's talk about how big the doors need to be. Now, I would recommend you measure the opening of your cabinet after you build the carcass and then cut the doors. Don't cut the doors first or anything, because if you do, they might not be the right size once you actually finish the carcass. With our miters, with the thickness of your plywood, sometimes those things change, and in sliding doors, you know, 1/4 of an inch could make a huge difference in whether or not these are gonna work. So I built my carcass and then I measured for these doors. The width is irrelevant. It's kind of whatever you want it to be based on your aesthetic. Just make sure they're square, make sure your carcass is square, of course, what are we talking about here? Then with the tongues, you want to make sure that your bottom tongue is taller than the depth of your bottom groove. And that way, the front of your door doesn't pull too much on the bottom. And this only has to be like a 1/16 of an inch. The top tongue just needs to sit in there. Ooh, that's nice. Now don't stress if your doors don't slide perfectly right away. You might put the doors in, you've measured everything, you've followed these tips, and you're like, Dan, these doors are not sliding how you said they would, you liar.
I wish you weren't a liar.
You need to do a couple things. Number one, you might need to wax the rails a little bit, but number two, and probably the more important part, you need to sand down those doors and make them really smooth so that they run smoothly against each other. Oftentimes you can just add a little wax in there, you can sand down the door, and you can get that thing moving so smoothly and very satisfactorily. And here's a bonus tip. I said 3, but here's 4. One thing I did is, because I made this out of white oak and the client wanted white oak and walnut, and I knew I was going to be cutting these grooves in here, and I knew when I cut the grooves, it would expose what's underneath the plywood, the MDF core, or whatever it might be. I didn't want that look here. So what I did is I used some edge banding and I cut it thin so it would fit within the rail, and then I ironed that down. If you've never used glue edge banding, my build video for this talks through how to put that on and how to use it. It's really simple with an iron, totally worth it. But it makes the aesthetic much better here, and it actually has the benefit of allowing this to slide a little bit better because it's a smoother surface than what would have been in the exposed MDF. I didn't veneer the top of the grooves because it's not necessary at all, and no one's ever really gonna look underneath this. Maybe some like 2-year-old, but if some 2-year-old's critiquing your furniture, you know, kick them out. Say, what are you doing? You can hardly talk. So that's 3 tips on how to make sliding doors on a cabinet. If you want to see how this build came out, check out this video and it will show you the whole process from start to finish. Have a great day.